Mayor Thornton stood at the threshold of the town hall, the wind a physical blow against his chest. It was a wind born in the iron heart of the north, a thing of teeth and claws that scoured the very hope from the landscape. He pulled his greatcoat tighter, the wool a pathetic shield against the onslaught. The snow was no longer falling, it was a horizontal fusillade, a blinding white rage that erased the world, burying the street, the houses, the future itself under a shroud of impossible cold. He thought of her then, as he had every hour since the sky had turned to slate. Anya! The widow! The madwoman of the mountain! He pictured her in that hovel of hers, a mere scratch in the unforgiving face of the granite peak, with her small boy and that wolf-like dog. He felt a pang of what he believed was righteous pity, a sorrow sharpened by the certainty of his own wisdom. He had warned her. He had pleaded with her, had offered her the town's charity, a place by a communal hearth. He had done all a good man could do. And she, with that quiet, unnerving stillness in her eyes, had refused. Now, this blizzard, the likes of which no elder could recall, was her grim reward. He was certain, with the unshakable confidence of a man who had always been right, that she and the boy were already gone, their fire long since extinguished, their breath frozen in their lungs. A tragic, foolish end. He was a good man, mourning a lost soul. He was wrong. He was wrong about the fire, wrong about the boy, wrong about the woman. He was wrong about everything. He understood nothing of the cold, and even less of the heat that can burn within a human heart when it has nothing left to lose but its own stubborn, defiant beat. To understand the mountain, and the woman who had made it her heart, we have to go back. Back to the silence that followed the collapse at the silver mine. A silence that was not empty, but filled with the weight of unsaid goodbyes and the crushing finality of rock and earth. Anya's husband, Cormac, was in that silence. His laughter, which had been the scaffolding of her world, was gone. His hands, calloused and kind, were gone. In their place was a void, and around that void gathered the townspeople, their faces masks of communal sorrow. They brought casseroles and condolences, their pity a blanket woven from nettles. It scratched and suffocated. They saw a fragile thing, a woman broken by grief, a pale vessel to be filled with their charity and their expectations. They gave her a small shack at the edge of town, its timber sighing in the wind, and told her she was safe. But safety felt like a cage. Every corner of the town held a ghost. The mercantile where Cormac had bought her a blue ribbon for her hair. The path by the creek where he had taught their son, Finn, to skip stones. The very air was thick with memory, and the town's kindness was a constant reminder of her lack, her incompleteness. Finn, at 7 years old, was a miniature echo of his father, his eyes holding a bewildered sorrow that Anya felt powerless to soothe. He grew quiet, a little shadow at her side. Her dog, Borrow, a great German shepherd with amber eyes that held an ancient loyalty, rarely left her feet. He was a warm, breathing anchor in a world that had come untethered. The grief was not an emotion, it was a physical state. It was the ice in her blood, the stone in her gut. And fear was its constant companion, a cold whisper that told her she and the boy were vulnerable, exposed, and that the town's pity would eventually curdle into impatience. She would not be a burden. She would not be a ghost in her own life. She would not break. One night, as the autumn wind rattled the shack's single window, Anya remembered a story Cormac used to tell. He spoke of the mountain not as a dead thing, a lump of rock to be plundered, but as a sleeping giant. He talked of its lungs, a network of caves and fissures that breathed with the changing seasons, exhaling cold air in the summer and warm air in the winter. The other miners had laughed, but Cormac had been mesmerized. "There's a world in there, Anya," he'd whispered, a secret heart the thought, once planted, began to grow, a seed of impossible hope in the barren soil of her sorrow. The next morning, with Finn holding her hand and Borrow scouting ahead, she walked away from the town, towards the sheer granite face of the peak. She felt the town's eyes on her back, felt their whispers follow her like burrs. "She's losing her mind," they would say. "Grief has undone her, let them." Their world had failed her. She would seek another. For weeks, she explored the base of the mountain, her search methodical and desperate. It was there, in a secluded fold of the foothills, that she found her. An old woman named Maeve, who lived in a stone hut so seamlessly built into the landscape it seemed to have grown there. Maeve was as weathered as the rock she lived on, her face a map of seasons, her eyes sharp and clear. She was an outcast, a woman who spoke more to the crows than to people. She watched Anya for days before she spoke a single word. "You are not looking for a grave," Maeve said, her voice like stones grinding together. It was not a question. "I am looking for a home," Anya replied, her own voice startling her with its strength. Maeve stared at her, then at Finn, then at the loyal dog. She saw not madness, but a will as hard as the mountain itself. "The mountain gives shelter," Maeve said, turning back to her hut. "But it demands a price. It does not yield to force. It answers only to patience." The work began. It was a task of impossible scale, a battle waged with a rusty pickaxe, a shovel, and the raw strength of her own grieving body. Maeve did not give her instructions. She gave her riddles. "Listen to the stone," she would say. "Some stone sings when it's struck. That is the stone that will hold. Other stone weeps. That is the stone that will betray you." Anya learned to listen. She found the entrance Cormac had spoken of, a narrow fissure hidden behind a curtain of ancient ivy. The air that breathed from it was cool and smelled of damp earth and deep time. With Borrow standing guard and Finn clearing the smaller debris, Anya began to carve a life from the rock. Every swing of the pickaxe was an act of defiance. The shock of the impact traveled up her arms, a painful reverberation that seemed to shake the grief loose, transmuting it into sweat and determination. Her hands, once soft, became a landscape of blisters and calluses. She was not digging a hole, she was shaping a space. She followed the natural contours of the cavern, widening a passage here, clearing a rockfall there. The first chamber was vast and cathedral-like, with a ceiling so high their lantern light could not reach it. It was cold and terrifying, the darkness absolute. But it was a beginning. Finn, small as he was, became her partner. He carried stones in his little bucket, his face smudged with dirt, his expression one of grave importance. He was no longer a shadow. In the heart of the mountain, he was a builder. Barrow, ever vigilant, would often stop and press his ear to the stone walls, his low growl alerting her to loose shale or unstable ground long before she could see it. They were a trinity of purpose, a silent, focused team working against the coming winter. The whispers from the town grew louder, carried on the wind. "She's gone feral," they murmured at the mercantile. Living in a cave like an animal, their judgment was a distant hum, a meaningless noise from a world she no longer inhabited. Her world was the scent of stone dust, the ache in her muscles, and the slow, miraculous transformation of a dark, dead space into a promise. The heart of any home is its hearth, and Anya knew that without fire, the mountain would be a tomb, not a sanctuary. This was the task that frightened her most. A mistake here, a poorly drawn flue, and the smoke would poison them in their sleep. Maeve, seeing the fear in her eyes, led her not to a book or a diagram, but to a creek bed miles away. "The mountain holds everything you need," she said, pointing to the thick, grey clay along the bank. "This is its glue. It holds fast when it feels the fire." For weeks, Anya hauled buckets of that clay, mixing it with sand and water until it was the perfect consistency. She chose the stones for the fireplace with a geologist's care, following Maeve's cryptic advice. Flat, dense stones for the base. Curved, weathered stones for the arch. She found a natural fissure, a thin crack that snaked its way up through the rock to the open air 100 feet above. This would be her chimney. The construction was slow, painstaking work. Each stone had to be set perfectly, each gap sealed with the clay mortar. Finn would hand her the smaller stones, his little hands patting them into place. Barrow would lie nearby, a silent, furry supervisor, his head on his paws. Mayor Thornton chose that time to make his final appeal. He rode up the trail, his face a mask of strained benevolence. He found her covered in clay and sweat, her hair wild, her eyes burning with a feverish light. "Anya, for the boy's sake," he pleaded, his voice echoing unnaturally in the cavern entrance. "This is no place to live. Winter is coming. "The town will provide for you." His words, meant to be kind, were laced with a condescension that scraped her raw. He saw a madwoman playing with mud and rocks. He could not see the architecture of her survival. "We have a home, Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "We are quite safe." He left, shaking his head, convinced he had just witnessed the final, tragic unraveling of a mind consumed by sorrow. 2 days later, Anya stacked the first logs in her completed fireplace. She struck a match, and as the kindling caught, a perfect, clean draft drew the smoke up the hidden flue. A warm, golden light pushed back the ancient darkness. It was not just heat. It was life. It was victory. With the hearth established, the mountain began to feel less like a cave and more like a fortress. Anya's focus shifted from construction to provision, from shelter to sustenance. Survival was not an event, it was a process, a rhythm. She explored the deeper chambers, a labyrinth of passages and grottos that snaked into the mountain's core. Maeve had told her to follow the sound of water. Deep inside, she found it, a spring of pure, ice-cold water trickling from the rock, forming a small, clear pool. It was a source of life, hidden from the sun, that would never freeze. This chamber became her larder. The constant, deep chill of the rock was a natural cellar. She spent the last weeks of autumn in a frenzy of preparation. She traded the last of her husband's silver for sacks of flour, beans, salt, and sugar. She harvested wild onions and hardy root vegetables from the foothills. She smoked the venison she bought from a passing trapper, hanging the cured strips from the cavern ceiling. The air filled with the scent of hickory smoke, a smell that clung to the stone and spoke of security. Her most ambitious project was the livestock. She bartered her mother's locket for a small flock of chickens and 2 pregnant ewes. In a vast, secondary cavern, connected to the surface by a wide, slanting fissure that allowed slivers of daylight and fresh air to penetrate, she built a pen. The sheep, with their thick, oily fleece, adapted quickly to the cool, dim environment. The chickens clucked and scratched in the dry earth, their familiar sounds domesticating the cavernous space. Finn was their shepherd. He named the sheep and scattered their feed, his laughter echoing in a place that had only known silence for millennia. The home became a living, breathing ecosystem. The warmth from the fire, the smell of baking bread, the bleating of lambs, the lowing of burro sleeping by the hearth, it was a world unto itself, complete and self-sufficient, hidden away from the judgment and pity of the world below. She had not merely found a refuge, she had created a kingdom. The days grew shorter. The wind sharpened, honing its edge on the high peaks. A profound and beautiful stillness settled over the mountain. From their hidden home, Anya and Finn watched the world prepare for its long sleep. The aspen groves on the slopes below turned from green to a brilliant, violent gold, a final, fiery defiance before the coming white. "The trees are burning," Finn whispered one evening, his face pressed against a small opening in the rock that overlooked the valley. "It's their last song before winter," Anya said, her arm around his small shoulders. Inside their stone sanctuary, life had found its peaceful cadence. The rhythms were simple, elemental. They woke to the soft glow of the fire, tended the animals, shared their meals at a table made from a great flat slab of slate, and slept to the sound of the wind's muffled song high above them. Anya taught Finn his letters, scratching them with charcoal onto smooth, pale stones. Barrow, their silent guardian, would divide his time between the warmth of the fire and the cool darkness of the entrance, ever watchful, ever present. There was no fear here. The mountain held them. It was a fortress, a womb, a home in the truest sense of the word. They were not just surviving, they were thriving, in a place no one else believed life was possible. Below, in the town of prosperity, the people saw the thin, occasional wisp of smoke rising from the mountain and shook their heads. It was a signal of her madness, they believed. A stubborn refusal to accept the inevitable. They imagined her shivering, starving, a grim tableau of a woman who had chosen rock and cold over community and warmth. The dramatic irony was a chasm deep as the valley itself. They, in their sturdy wooden houses, surrounded by neighbors and governed by proven wisdom, were the ones who were vulnerable. They had forgotten how to listen to the wind. They had forgotten the mountain's ancient power. They pitied the woman who was safer than any of them. Then it came. It did not arrive like a normal storm, with a gradual darkening of the sky and a gentle prelude of flakes. It fell upon the valley like a judgment. One moment, the air was still and cold, the next, the world was gone, erased by a solid wall of white. The wind did not howl, it shrieked, a solid thing that hammered against walls and tore at roofs. The people of prosperity huddled in their homes, feeding their stoves, confident in their preparations. But this was no ordinary blizzard. It was a living entity, a white devil with a heart of ice. The first day, it was a novelty, an inconvenience. By the third day, fear began to creep in. The temperature plummeted to a degree that was not just cold, but actively hostile to life. Windows, coated in thick layers of frost, shattered from the pressure. The wind found every crack, every seam in their well-built homes, pouring in like a tide of liquid cold. Woodpiles, meant to last a month, dwindled at an alarming rate. Food became a concern. No one could get to the communal stores, and what was in their pantries would not last forever. The town, which had always felt like a bastion of safety, was revealed to be a fragile collection of isolated, freezing traps. Inside the mountain, Anya stoked the fire. The storm was a distant rumor, a dull, percussive roar far above them. The thick stone walls, insulated by tons of earth, did not transmit the cold. The air in their chambers remained temperate, filled with the smells of roasting meat and the earthy scent of the sheep. Finn played with Borrow by the hearth, oblivious to the war being waged on the world outside. Anya would occasionally go to the entrance, a heavy door she had fashioned from cured hide stretched over a crude wooden frame, and listen. She could feel the vibration of the storm through the soles of her feet, a deep, resonant tremor. The mountain was shuddering, but it was not yielding. It was holding. She felt a profound, humbling gratitude. She had come to the mountain seeking shelter from her grief, and it had given her a fortress against the apocalypse. By the fifth day, prosperity was dying. The town hall, the sturdiest building, had become a desperate refuge, but its great fireplace consumed wood at an insatiable rate and offered little warmth against the drafts that sliced through the room. Families huddled together under piles of blankets, their breath misting in the frigid air. The weak began to cough. The children cried with a thin, listless sound. Mayor Thornton looked at the faces around him, pale and pinched with cold and fear, and saw the utter failure of his world. Their fences, their laws, their communal stores, it had all been an illusion of control. Nature, in its indifferent fury, had swept it all away. His certainty, his lifelong conviction in the rightness of conventional wisdom, had crumbled to dust. And in the ruin of his pride, a single, impossible thought took root. The smoke. The madwoman. The fool who had chosen to live in a cave. What if she? It was a desperate, illogical hope, the last ember in a dying fire. But it was all he had left. "We have to try," he announced, his voice hoarse. The others looked at him as if he had lost his mind. Go out into that? Into the teeth of the blizzard? It was suicide. But the alternative was to stay and freeze to death. He gathered 3 of the strongest men. They wrapped themselves in every layer of clothing they possessed, tied a rope around their waist so they would not lose each other in the whiteout, and stepped out into the screaming chaos. The journey was a pilgrimage through hell. The wind tore at them, stealing their breath and driving ice crystals into their eyes. They could not see more than a foot in front of them. They navigated by memory and instinct, crawling more than walking, aiming for the spot on the mountain where they had last seen the smoke. It was Thornton who found it. Stumbling over a snow-covered rock, he fell forward and his hand landed on something that was not rock. It was hide, stretched taut. A door. He pounded on it with a frozen fist, his knuckles splitting, his throat too raw to shout. He pounded until he had no strength left, slumping against it, ready to accept his end. The hide door swung inward. The men, half blinded by the blizzard, fell into the opening, collapsing onto a floor of smooth, dry earth. And they were met not by darkness and death, but by a wave of impossible warmth. They smelled baking bread, and wood smoke, and living animals. As their eyes adjusted, they saw it. A vast, vaulted space, lit by the golden glow of a massive, roaring fireplace. They saw pens holding sheep and clucking chickens. They saw shelves carved into the rock, laden with jars and sacks of food. And they saw the woman. Anya stood before them, not a madwoman, not a ghost, but a figure of profound and quiet strength. Her son, Finn, peeked out from behind her, his eyes wide with curiosity, not fear. The great dog at her side let out a low rumble but did not move. Mayor Thornton struggled to his knees, the snow melting from his coat and pooling around him. He looked at the impossible scene, at this world built of stubbornness and stone, this kingdom hidden in the heart of the mountain. He saw the hearth she had built with her own hands, the larder that would feed an army, the life she had nurtured against all odds. He saw everything he had pitied, everything he had dismissed, and he understood that it was not madness. It was a deeper, older wisdom. All his authority, all his civic pride, was reduced to a single, desperate need. He looked up at the woman he had tried to save, the woman who had, in fact, saved herself, and his voice was a broken whisper. "Help us," he begged. "Please. The town. The children. We are freezing." Anya looked down at the man who represented the world that had cast her out. There was no triumph in her eyes, no vindictiveness. There was only a calm, steady compassion. She knelt, placing a hand on his shoulder. "There is room," she said. "Bring them all." They came. A long, struggling line of shivering souls, guided by the rope, a human chain of desperation moving from a world of failed wood and glass to one of proven stone and fire. Anya, with Borrow at her side, stood at the entrance like a lighthouse keeper, guiding them out of the storm and into the harbor of the mountain. One by one, the people of prosperity entered her home, their faces a mixture of disbelief, awe, and shame. They saw the thriving world she had built while they had been whispering about her sanity. They drank her broth, warmed themselves by her fire, and listened to the impossible sound of children laughing while the blizzard shrieked its impotent fury outside. For 7 days, the storm raged. And for 7 days, the community of prosperity was reborn, not in their town hall, but in the heart of the mountain. They were stripped of their old roles, mayor, blacksmith, merchant, and became simply people, sharing a space, a fire, a chance at life. They saw Anya not as the poor widow, but as their protector, their provider. They learned her rhythms, helped tend her animals, and witnessed the quiet, unyielding strength that had accomplished the impossible. When the storm finally broke and the sun shone on a world transformed and buried, it was Anya who led them back out into the light. The town had survived, and they knew who to thank. They never looked at her, or the mountain, the same way again. The caves became a communal shelter, a place of last resort, its passages mapped and its larder always stocked. Anya's methods, once seen as madness, became their wisdom. And so, the story of the widow who carved a home from the stone became a parable, a lesson whispered from one generation to the next. A reminder that the greatest strength is often found not in what is built to be seen, but in the foundations laid in the dark. So when the world tells you that your hope is madness, that your path is foolish and unwalkable, what will you do? When the wind of doubt howls at your door and the structures you once trusted begin to fail, what mountain are you willing to carve? What fire are you willing to build deep inside the rock of your own resolve? The stone is cold, and the work is hard. But the heart is a furnace. And it is always, always enough.